Okay, welcome back to this session. We have three amazing speakers on issues around IP and antitrust. The first one is Dr. Israel Cedillo Lazcano, Universidad de las Américas, Puebla. He's a full-time lecturer and researcher in banking and IT law, and also recently become Director of Research and Graduate Studies for the entire university, so congrats on that. As I mentioned yesterday, he has a very important Edinburgh connection because he did a PhD here. He was working also one of the main people behind Script and Scripted, and his main expertise is in IP, AI, financial innovation, and the legal nature of money. So, Israel, thank you very much for being here. You have 15 minutes. And then we're going to have 10 minutes of questions following up that. Is that okay? Thank you. Thank you. Would you like to use this?
Yeah. Thank you very much to everyone. Certainly, as Guido says, it's a pleasure for me to be here today before you. I love Scotland, and I'm always happy to return to this awesome place. Wait, today I'm going to talk about the relationship that is not exploratively related to between intellectual property and banking law, monetary law to be more specific. Most of the times when we talk about the lex monetae, when we talk about financial regulation, when we talk about the issuance of money, these works tend to be found in banking law course books, in economics books, among others. But it's in very rare occasions explored to the relevance of IP law, particularly in the context of the management of infrastructures. And today, well, as we have seen throughout this conference, we have realized how technological infrastructures have been behind current interactions, but in other circumstances beyond the Fourth Industrial Revolution, this is not explored deeply. So through this project that I'm currently developing, and is currently under development, I want to highlight the relevance of intellectual property in the context of monetary law, in the case of lex monetae to be more specific, and I will use, to illustrate this relevance, the concept of the digital commercial society. Why I am using this concept of the commercial society first? Well, it's a concept that is closely related to Scotland. Okay, it's a concept that emerges from the work of Adam Smith, David Hume, like works like the Jure Regni of Scotus, that eventually highlighted the relevance of individual efforts that fostered the development of the commercial society. Now, in our context, this becomes relevant after the great financial crisis of 2008-2009. Why? Because people start to ask or start to challenge these concepts, these notions of trust on governments, on financial architectures. We start to ask ourselves, can we trust in banks? Should we trust in banks? Yes, well, they have our savings, central banks create money, but can we create money too? And we start to see the developing of projects like Bitcoin, FinTech, decentralized finance, among others, that based on the development of open source software, cloud computing, machine learning, among other set of technologies, allow individuals to create or to present proposals to democratize, to open finance to everyone. So everyone can become a banker under certain circumstances and start to challenge these notions that banks that banks that are too big to fail or too complex to fail are the elements more relevant in the financial ecosystem. So now we start to talk about that individuals even can act as these stakeholders within our financial systems. Now, to materialize this, you cannot say only, I will be a banker by myself. You have to ask yourself, how can I materialize these dreams? How can I create liquidity? And of course, most important, how can I introduce this liquidity in the economy? Now, for that, my main argument is that you have to understand the long relationship between intellectual property and money, because everyone has an opinion on money. We have coins, we have notes, we have bank accounts, but money does not exist in isolation. It needs infrastructures to circulate, even to exist by itself. Okay, you need to print it, you need to coin it, you need to have an entire system that supports the records that says that you have certain amount of liquidity to be claimed. So we have that the lex monetae that in most banking law books says that are consistent in the prerogatives of the state to determine how they are going to issue money, the amount of money that they are going to issue, and of course the nominative value of it. We have to add the element of the decisions related to the infrastructures that we are going to employ to put that money in circulation. I argue that within this concept of the lex monetae, infrastructures are a very important element of this lex monetae. And it's so relevant that in the paper I'm making a comparison, for instance, of the development of the evolution of the IP law regime and monetary law. For instance, we have a common element that emerges from the Bretton Woods agreements that is also under-analyzed and is one of the main issues that I want to take in this paper. Now, we have, well, first, we have, in the context of intellectual property, we have that industrial property has been related to the creation of money, to the assignment of patents on coinage, on printing notes, but also in the context of copyright, we have the issues of design, and even we have this quotation that I took out of a paper I recently read, that when copyright infringement derived in a death sentence related to forgery of money, okay? And for instance, we have the case of William Hartnett, a still live $5 bill in the US, in which a court in New York forbid a painter to paint money because the court argued that this painter was very good and he had the potential to become a forger. So William Hartnett was expressly prohibited by a New York court to paint money because he was very good at it. Now, this intellectual property has been behind the development of value chains, okay? Now, but value chains are, I repeat, under-analyzed in the context of money. I repeat, money does not exist in isolation, and I like this case very much to illustrate this point, because when we are talking about money and value chains, most of the times we tend to think about, oh, blockchain, machine learning, DevOps for the creation of money, of electronic money. But this is not a new issue. We have this case of Banco de Portugal versus Waterloo and Sons, in which the Central Bank of Portugal ordered the printing of certain amount of escudos. Okay, the problem here is that the central bank doesn't have a printer in its premises. It had to hire an external provider to print this amount of money. Now, what is the problem when you do not control this part of your value chain? That you could face negative externalities, in this case, the intervention of a criminal group that had access to the plates of Waterloo and Sons to print additional millions of escudos to put in circulation for criminal activities. So the central bank discovered this and had to retire the entire issue to avoid these additional millions to start in circulation. So in this case, we have a very basic element of a value chain that is a company that was dedicated to the printing of money. But what will happen in the context of the Fourth Industrial Revolution? What happens if you are talking about blockchain? I say blockchain because it's the most popular technology being discussed in the context of money, but it could be another one. But what will happen if you, as central bank, do not control or do not understand who is behind the creation of your monetary assets? What will happen if we have to face a Banco de Portugal scenario, where one of your technological providers takes the advantage of being part of your value chain to create additional amounts of liquidity. Certainly it could have, if we are talking about, for instance, of central bank digital currencies, we could have macroprudential issues there. We could have problems of moral hazard, systemic risk, among others. So one of the elements that we need to introduce and highlight when we are talking about this kind of potential, or these potential risks, are the principles introduced by the institutions like the Bank for International Settlements, particularly the principles for resilience. And here I highlight three of the main principles found in this proposal presented by the Bank for International Settlements, that in few words says that you as a bank, including central banks, you have to identify who are your providers, how are they interconnected, not only within your own infrastructure, but beyond it, and how can you understand it? So you have to be able to map the interconnections of your infrastructure and, of course, explain them to regulators, to supervisors. If you are not able to do so, you could have problems. And again, I repeat, you could face something like the problems that Banco de Portugal had to face several years ago. One of the main strategies that could be useful for it, and some of my colleagues here have addressed in certain way through their presentations, is identification of controllers, of stakeholders, for instance, in the context of who has a license, who is the owner of the moral rights, the economic rights, and even in the context of personal data protection, because some of the elements that have been discussed in the development of CBDCs, stable coins, among other monetary innovations, is how can you support the protection of personal data through new infrastructures, because now if you pay with a note, with a coin, it's anonymous. But what happens if you use a wallet, what if you have an account in an exchange, you have personal data. Even you can argue that money is a piece of personal data. Someone yesterday was saying, yes, the name of a dog can be a piece of personal data. Yes, probably under certain circumstances, even liquidity can become a piece of personal data within these infrastructures. So how are we going to map these interactions of licenses, moral rights, economic rights, definitions of controllers, processors of personal data? So I have here a very superficial example on how can you model, or as a bank, the interactions between the personal data protection, intellectual property law, and of course, the execution of monetary policy, if you are talking about a central bank, or even the creation of endogenous liquidity, if you are talking about a commercial bank. And this is very important because at the end of the day, we are going to face two main risks if we do not address this accurately. That is operational and systemic risk. And the best case, and the best example, better said, that we have of these consequences is Silicon Valley Bank. Now, some of the lessons that we are taking from Silicon Valley Bank's collapse is that bank runs are not like those old bank runs that we used to see in the 20th century when people made long queues to get their money out of the bank. But now runs are becoming associated to technological issues. In the case of Silicon Valley Bank, yes, there was an element of the interest rate, but it was related to certain amounts of stable coins supported by US dollars. And given that most of the people that was involved in this investment were unsophisticated investors, fear was present. People went out to get their money out of Silicon Valley Bank. And of course, the bank had to be intervened by the Federal Reserve using the Article 13.3 of the Federal Reserve Act. Now, what will happen if something related to the technological infrastructure fails? Imagine that in the case of Silicon Valley Bank, you hear in the news that they do not understand their blockchain, or that someone hacked the entire system of Silicon Valley Bank. It could have a repercussion on how the people trust on this bank, on how can the public perceives this bank, and of course, unleash a run. Okay? Well, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm open to answer any of your questions or doubts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Israel. That was brilliant. And now we have our next speaker, Aline Iramina. She's a PhD student and researcher at the University of Glasgow and Create. She's also a Brazil qualified lawyer and civil servant obviously on leave with experience in copyright regulation. And she's particularly interested in copyright governance by algorithms and the role of transparency. So without further ado, Aline, thank you very much for being here. The floor is yours, and you have 15 minutes.
Thank you, Guido. First of all, thank you for having me here. I attended also the first annual conference of SCOTLIN in Stirling last year, so it's nice to be back. And one of the interesting is that actually when I presented last year, it was a more advanced part of my thesis, so I'm coming back and could be kind of my first chapter. So I'm trying to explain a little bit about why we can talk about copyright governance by and of algorithms, and then I use the music industry in the UK to illustrate how the impact of algorithms on copyright. So one of the things, if you have the opportunity to read my paper, I try to explain a little bit how we have this development of different kinds of concept of governance on the internet. So governance is something that we have been discussing for many years in different kinds of legal fields. For example, in other areas, we have a lot of research in political sciences, international relations, discuss the role of governance in contrast to regulation, and talking about how law and government regulation are not the only sources of rulemaking. Then in the last, when we had the emergence of internet in the 1990s, we start talking about this idea of internet governance, especially in the US. We have like the Lex Informatica from Heidelberg, you have the Codes Law of Lessig, and here in the UK we have the active matrix network theory from Andrew Murray. All of them discussed the importance of the new technologies and also the design, the systems design for how internet works and how users use the internet. So, and one of the things that's interesting about Andrew Murray is that he already talked about in 2010, and then you have other people also discussing the idea of the important role of platforms as gatekeepers. And then you have Gillespie, which I think is one of the most well-known researchers when you talk about platform governance. Here in the EU, there's a really good paper from Robert Gorwa. He had discussed all this concept and why we can talk about platform governance. And then he highlights how the practices, policies, and affordances of platforms and their complex effect on the contemporary life. So he discussed this, and he discussed how you have implications on politics, on labor relations, and also on cultural consumption and counterproduction. And then more recently, we start discussing this idea of algorithm governance, which could be considered a strand of platform governance with a focus on the role of algorithms. And what is interesting is that a lot of people have been discussing in the last few years how algorithms have impacted many different fields, and in the cultural industry is not different. But also one of the things, and one of the papers I like a lot, it's Lazcano and Just paper. They discuss a lot the role of algorithms. And one of the things they say is that when you talk about governance by algorithms, usually this is a discussion that is followed by a governance of algorithms, because you should not only discuss the impact of algorithms on society, but also how governments and also other actors have been trying to control and actually deal with the effects of algorithms on society. So in my paper, what I try to do is discuss this idea of copyright governance, which I define as a form of social order coordinated by multiple copyright actors, mechanisms, structures, involving rulemaking, enforcement process that go beyond the state command and control, involve actors from a much wider community, and following the Lazcano and Just division between governance by and governance of algorithms, I divide my paper in this idea of copyright governance by algorithms and copyright governance of algorithms. So what I try to do is, and I think you realize probably if you have the program that I changed my presentation. One of the reasons for that, it's because I started drafting this chapter paper like a year ago, and my initial idea was actually do a full empirical research. I was using the nodal governance theory. That's why I talk about nodes, networks, and everything. But what I realized is that for this first part, what I wanted was more to illustrate what copyright governance means. And also what I realized is that the data that I have was quite limited at the time, and I didn't want to focus on that. So, and then the theory didn't apply. It just didn't work. Sometimes you might like a theory, but you cannot use it because it doesn't work for. So I changed a little bit my research. So what I decided to do, I still kept it I decided to keep with the Economic of Music Streaming Inquiry documents. I did a document analysis of them. I started doing a content analysis of the documents, but just selecting the parts that they mentioned algorithms. And then I asked, after I did a thematic analysis to analyze what are the main concerns of the main copyright actors or about the impact of algorithms on the music industry. In the second part, to illustrate the idea of copyright governance of algorithms, I did a doctoral and legal analysis of the current literature, legislations, and and especially I focused more at this part of the research on the policy documents that we have been discussing on copyright and platform regulation in the UK. So this is just a diagram, something that I developed just to make clear how you can see the impact of algorithms, and in contrast, you have this idea of how governments and how the parliament influence and try to regulate the use of algorithms. So in my research, when I was analyzing the documents from the Economic of Music Streaming Inquiry, my two main questions was first, one of them was who are the main actors of this industry, and then to analyze what are their main concerns regarding algorithms. So the group of actors are quite obvious when you analyze, when you're already familiar with the music industry. You have the creators, which you associate both with the songwriters, the composers, the artists. You have the record labels, you have the publishers, you have collecting societies who have like an extremely important role in the music industry. You have the users, you have the digital service providers, because this is the term that in the UK they like to use for music streaming services. And you have other groups of actors who also contributed to the inquiry. For example, some broadcast companies like BBC and other organizations. So, and when I was analyzed, one of the things is that you could see that their concerns, especially in terms of algorithms, repeated. They have like the same concern, especially most of the contributions came from creators, so they kind of repeat themselves, like especially so when you talk about the teams, I think algorithm bias and algorithm opacity are two big issues on algorithms that regardless of which industry or which area you analyze, people will always discuss their concerns about algorithm bias. In the music industry, their main concerns about popularity bias. They say that they are worried that sometimes popular artists are favored by algorithms. So for example, this might harm niche artists or self-releasing artists that don't have the money to invest to have more visibility in these platforms. Algorithm opacity, I think everybody's familiar, and one of the things they are always requesting is more transparency. They wanted to understand how these algorithm systems work and how they influence how users find their music, how they are consuming their music, how they are being remunerated. The other two topics, I think it's more about the effects already. We talk about a lot of algorithm influence on creative remuneration, and the other one is algorithms influence on music consumption. And then in the second one, it's more about the discussions of algorithms as gatekeepers of the music industry, because they say that as you had DJs, as you had music experts, you always had this kind of gatekeeping in the music industry. Now you have platforms and algorithms having these influences of how people discover music and how they consume and access music. And finally, the algorithm content moderation. I think for me, if you analyze the documents, you will see that different from most of the discussions on copyright, usually when you analyze discussion on copyright, it focused a lot on content moderation, but in this aspect, it was referred just a few times. And one of the reasons for that is because it was a very industry-oriented inquiry, so you almost didn't have any participation from users in the discussions. So, for example, usually for content moderation, usually for discussions on copyright and content moderation, when we were analyzing Article 17 of the Copyright and the Digital Single Market Directive in the EU, everybody talked about how these new technologies impact freedom of speech or something like that. But here in these discussions in the UK, you see that nobody raises that because it was not the main aspect that they were concerned. When you talk about content moderation, what they talk about, one, from the artist's perspective, is they were concerned about how their music were being demoted in some kinds of platforms because it didn't fit the algorithm's criteria. So for example, if they were doing music, some kind of music that is controversial, let's say, that deals with politics or something, they could have their music demoted and they were not even aware of it. And also the discussions that we always have from industry about piracy, about how these algorithms are not enough to prevent people, users, from uploading unauthorized content on these platforms, particularly YouTube. So one of the examples, because since I use the concerns, the main stakeholders' concerns about algorithms to analyze what would be some of the impacts on the industry, I just brought one example. There are a lot of discussion about this algorithm bias and how, in some ways, since users just receive the same kind of content that should match their taste, this could reduce the discovery of new music, homogenizes music tastes, reduces creativity and music diversity, because one of the things they say is that since there is a kind of music that makes success, some artists might adapt and try to compose, to fit this kind of song that makes success on the streaming platforms. This would disempower self-releasing less popular artists and in some way impact creative remuneration. But one of the things that we could see is that the DCMS Select Committee in the final report was not very convinced because they said that there was not enough evidence about that. There's a lot of these discussions that this could be, but is it true or not? And even in this research, it's not clear. So one of the recommendations was, okay, let's check and let's see if this is true. So they request the government to make some research, further research about this. So when you talk about how governments and how state could regulate that, first of all, when I talk about copyright governance of algorithms, what I try to do is to discuss that different from copyright law, which has this idea of the principle of territoriality that applies to each territory. When we talk about especially on the internet, you have this multi-jurisdictional aspect of copyright governance. And there are also all this discussion about how, for example, you have this unilateral regulatory globalization of laws, which occurs when a single state is able to externalize its law and regulations outside its border through market mechanisms, resulting in the globalizations of standards. We have this case, for example, especially now with the Brussels effect in the EU, we have which the GDPR is very clear, but in the copyright law, it was very clear with Section 512 of the DMCA, which we have this idea of the limitation of the liability of platforms for third-party infringement on their platforms. So there are these different regulatory approaches that the government discuss. I'm not going to go further, but there's the idea that there's not much to do because, for example, if you analyze the CMA study on the music market industry, they say that it's working okay. So for now, there is no evidence that they should intervene in some way for a competition aspect. The CDAA, which is the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation, also made some studies on the recommendation algorithms, and they said that also there's the suspicions of artists, there's no evidence that it's true. So what they would recommend for now is that to alleviate some of these suspicions that actually governments actually the platforms should improve their transparency, should be more clear about how they use and how their algorithms work. There's some regulation about co-regulation as well, and the statutory regulation would be more the one that would be fit more for copyright law, that there's discussion that there should be a right to actual remuneration for performances in sound recording when they are streamed, because nowadays they don't have this right, because it's just applied for broadcast. And for example, the stream is considered making available here in the UK, so they usually don't apply. I also analyze, and then I know my time is probably off, so I also analyze some of the rules governing the use of algorithms, and you see that the UK, they retain some of the legislations from the EU, so the GDPR and the P2B regulations. They come with some new rules to regulate algorithms, or at least to increase transparency of in the use of algorithms. You have the online safety bill. Sorry. The online safety bill, which analyze more the content moderation aspects, and when approved, it probably will bring some more information about that. And what I'm trying to say, analyzing all this legal framework, is that you can see that to regulate algorithms, one of the things we realize is that at least recommendation algorithms, they are not focusing much on copyright law. So maybe we have to check if it would be for copyright law or not. Most of the regulations address mostly intermediaries. So for example, what happens when you talk about platforms like Spotify or Deezer, who are not considered, at least for the music service, and intermediaries? Should they be regulated somehow? Or it's okay just the intermediaries? And then there's this further research necessary to address some of the concerns, because until now there's no evidence, and the question is these concerns that they have algorithms are valid or not? And if transparency and accountability measures are the best way to deal with algorithms, and if there are any other alternative solutions. So I guess this is it. Sorry for taking more time. Thank you.
Thank you. That was excellent. Thank you. Any questions?